All right, I'd like to get on with our next panel here. This is on intermodal logistics, and it's my pleasure to introduce this session's moderator, our pal Bill Mongelluzzo. Bill is a senior editor with the Journal of Commerce. Founded in New York in 1827, the JOC covers international freight transportation and logistics. Bill joined JOC in 1980 after working as a reporter for 8 years with the New Orleans Times-Picayune. What is a Picayune?
It's a small coin.
A small coin. There we go. He has served, see, you learned something here. I know you do. He has served with the JOC in New Orleans, New York, and Long Beach. Bill is a native of Chicago and a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism. So join me in thanking Bill for being our moderator.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me to be moderator of this panel. As David said, intermodal logistics, a game changer for all parties. So by definition, intermodal means connecting various modes of transportation. And the previous panel set us up perfectly for what we're going to talk about, talking about the ports, the big ships. One thing they didn't say is, why are the carriers bringing in these big ships? And the answer really is embodied in who's going to be our first panelist, Dave Arsenal here. Dave is a happy person. He's always smiling. He's always got a joke to tell. But believe me, he's hurting inside. And the reason he's hurting is because the industry he works in is losing billions of dollars. I mean, since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, the global container shipping industry has had one profitable year in 2010. So what is their answer? What are the carriers doing? They can't raise their freight rates, so they're cutting costs. And they're cutting costs in two ways. One, they're getting together in alliances, or they're expanding the existing alliances. And then two, they're bringing in big ships. Now, Leslie mentioned the big ships. The previous panel went into extensive detail about the big ships. These vessels are having a huge impact on the supply chain, starting at the marine terminal and then cascading through to the trucking industry, the rail, and all the way to the distribution warehouses and the end users. Just to give you an example of what's happening at the marine terminal, I'll compare an average vessel call in LA Long Beach to an average vessel call in what are considered probably two of the most efficient U.S. ports, Savannah and Charleston. The big ships that were talked about earlier, now we're getting 14,000 TEU ships in LA Long Beach. The average now is probably getting closer to 10,000 in the Asia services. Those types of vessels, on average, will unload and reload 5,000 moves. That's 5,000 container moves per vessel call. Recently, there's been as many as 10,000 container moves per vessel call on some of the really big ships. You compare that to a Savannah, Charleston, and probably even going up to New York, 500, 800 moves per vessel call. So when you are taking off and putting on that many containers at one port, it's going to have a significant impact on the marine terminal. And in all honesty, it's not understood by the BCOs, the beneficial cargo owners. And I'll give you an example. Back in September, I was moderating a panel in Charleston, and a representative from one of those dollar stores, and believe me, when they ship, you know, when it's like a fixed cost shipper, they watch every penny. He was complaining about, you know, for the first time in his life, he had to start shipping cargo through LA Long Beach, the headaches, et cetera, et cetera. And then he says, and you know, sometimes I have to wait 3 days for my container. And so then, you know, afterwards I said, well, you know, you can do one vessel call in Charleston or in Savannah in one work shift, working 2 cranes if you're only going to do 500 moves. If you're going to do 5 to 10,000 moves, it's physically impossible to do it in one shift, in 2 shifts. It takes normally 5 work shifts. So you're talking that's spread over 3 days. What happens when this mass of cargo hits the marine terminal, it has a significant impact on the wharf, the key crane, on the yard itself in stacking the containers and retrieving them, and especially at the gate. And we're going to hear from Vic Rosa some of the congestion issues that he's had to deal with in recent years, and what his association, the Harbor Trucking Association, that his company's a member of, what they're doing to try to improve the gate flows. And then it continues on, into the hinterland, into the Inland Empire, where you have more than 1.5 billion square feet of, in Southern California, of warehouse and distribution space, and Fran Inman is going to tell us about that. If you're delayed at the marine terminal and you're delayed getting out of the gate, what happens, and you're going to get congestion on the freeways, and then, 50 miles later, you're at the warehouse. So you see this cascading effect. I'm not saying that this is bad. This is life. This is what we have to get used to. And I think we first saw the impact of the big ships around 5 years ago when the 8,000 TEU ships started calling on the West Coast. It was just a different animal, a different experience. And it took them a while, and they got adjusted. I think the terminals are pretty good now at handling 6,000 to 8,000 TEU ships. But now the 10s and the 12s and the 14,000 TEU ships are coming in, and it's the same problem again. It's just an order of magnitude. So with that, I am going to introduce our first panelist. Dave Arsenal is Vice President for Hyundai Merchant Marine, and he is responsible for leading the sales organization in its Pacific Southwest and Gulf region services. Dave?
Well, thank you, Bill. I am smiling on the outside, but maybe he didn't misrepresent how you're feeling on the inside with the kind of losses that our industry has experienced since the Great Recession. So as I'm speaking, there's a collection bin going around the room. Please give generously to a humble ship owner just trying to scrape by and make a living.
And order a new one.
And a bigger one.
I'm going to talk about the carrier side of the business, and specifically, as we get into this, just very quickly, where I've come from, Hyundai Merchant Marine. Our company has been in business for over 30 years. We're based in South Korea, but we have a very large network globally of vessels as well as terminals. And my role in this organization is basically leading the sales organization and communicating and negotiating contracts with the largest importers and exporters from across the country. So I have a very customer-oriented type of perspective on how they're looking at their supply chains, where they see us fitting into their supply chain, as well as one of the challenges of educating some of these retailers about the challenges that our industry is facing and the changes that the entire industry is now being forced to move through. I would like to just point out that the comments that I'm about to make are my own comments. I like to be able to speak very freely at these types of sessions. So this is the world according to Dave, not according to Hyundai Merchant Marine, as we go forward. So I get the disclaimer out of the way there. I'm going to start right off with, before jumping into big ships, why? What were the drivers? Why we see the Great Recession? I have customers say, you carriers do this to yourselves. You see the economy is recovering very slowly from this Great Recession. Why were you so foolish to go out and order these gigantic ships and then expect you're going to fill them? No wonder why you're losing money. And there's some truth to that. However, what really drove this is the most important thing. And this is the part of the story that I think most customers don't understand, and probably most of you in this room may not understand. It really started with environmental changes and regulatory changes, many of which started right here in California. I live in California, so I'm going to be speaking with a lot of passion today about what can we do to keep this business in California ports. This started actually in Europe, the emissions control area, which goes 200 miles off of the coast and now has extended to North America, including our friends to the north in Canada, where we have cleaner regulatory requirements now for the type of fuel and the emissions that those ships out of the smokestacks are emitting into the atmosphere from 200 miles off the coast. In California, the little box down there off to the left of the screen, you'll see that that requires actually this kicked in 2013, and in 2014, California actually fast-forwarded this regulation 1 full year ahead of the rest of North America, so that a 1% NOx and SOx emission is now a 0.1%, which requires a completely different type of marine fuel oil to satisfy that criteria. One that costs nearly double what our IFO 380 normally runs and what we're burning in the deep sea on these ships today. So the point that I'm making here is regulatory and environmental changes. We're moving fast and furious. We're spending $100 to $150 million to build a new ship. And what was happening, in order to get a return on that investment, the average life of a ship, we have to squeeze a good 25 plus years out of it. But what was happening is regulatory and environmental changes were taking place. We were not able to keep up with getting that kind of a shelf life out of these ships. We either had to look at retrofitting an existing fleet of ships at a very high cost with scrubber technology, and technology that maybe would get us to meet the minimum requirement for this year, but doesn't get us to clear the bar for the second year and the subsequent years following. Or do we just build a new ship with this technology built into the original footprint and design of the vessel? So it was a quandary for carriers. Many of us decided and elected retrofitting existing fleet was probably not the best solution. So it became a point of, let's build new ships. Then it became, if we're going to make the investment of building a new ship, what's the right size of a ship? If you look back at the average ocean freight rates for container shipping over the last 10 years, I think a lot of times we read the JOC, we look at the Shanghai Container Freight Index, we see volatility in spot market rates that resembles an EKG. But if you look at the average of averages of what a major retailer has paid for transportation from Hong Kong to LA over the last 10 years, it hasn't changed much. It really has not changed. We're bringing a box halfway around the world. They're paying about the same amount today as they were 10 years ago. But a lot of other things have changed, one being the cost of fuel, the terminal costs, labor costs. So all of these factors were going in where costs were going up, rates were staying the same. We've got to look at ships now. If we can't take other costs out, we've already seen carriers moving customer service offshore, downsizing organizations, stripping a lot of the value add out of their services to offer a basic, low-cost, high-quality service as best as possible. But what has happened now is to make that next step, we had to look at slot cost economies of scale, and that's where these mega ships get introduced into the picture. And what you're seeing here on the top is an 18,000 TEU ship. And these ships are not the ships that are calling from Asia to the US. These ships are deployed in the Asia to Europe trade. They transit through the Suez Canal. It's the longest deep sea trade route in the world, and this is where we gain the most efficiency of ships of this size. But what's happened with ships of this size that are now being deployed, they're displacing ships that at one time, just a few years ago, were considered very large ships of 8,000 to 12,000 TEUs, and those ships needed a home. Those are the ships that are now cascading out of the Asia to Europe theater into the Asia to US trade lane. So that's where these large ships are coming from. They're being displaced by these. Below that 18,000 TEU ship is the average size of a U.S. aircraft carrier. So just put some things in perspective there, the difference in size that we're talking about. It is pretty large scale. But I then equate this to somewhat of the arms race. One carrier makes a decision to say 18,000 TEU ships, that's the size we're going to go for. And that was the shot heard around the world. Every other carrier in the market said 18,000 Ts, how are we going to compete against this line with 18,000 TEU ships? Our ships are only 10 to 12,000 TEUs. There's too significant of a slot cost differential that would allow us to be able to continue to compete at this level when you start looking at $400 to $500 per 40-foot slot difference. So what happens? Other carriers jump on board and say, well, we've got to maybe not be right at 18, but we've got to close the gap on that 18 and start looking at ships at 13,000, 14, 15, all the way up to 18 to be able to compete long term. Otherwise, it's game over. So that's really what has started the evolution of these larger ships. And where the U.S. is benefiting from this is these larger ships that were in Asia to Europe are now cascading into this trade lane. So this is a new evolution. It's been going on, though, for a number of years. And what Bill had mentioned earlier is now where we have a 14,000 or a 10,000 TEU ship that comes into LA Long Beach, years back, we would have had 2 5,000 TEU ships come in, one at the beginning of the week, one at the middle of the week, spread the cargo out nicely. The terminal volumes get spread out nicely. Cargo's flowing out from the first ship before the next ship comes in. But now we're looking at a 10,000 TEU ship that's bringing in twice the amount of cargo, that's dumping it all at one time on a marine terminal in a much more densified fashion, and it's putting strain on the supply chain. I've spent the last 6 weeks explaining to customers, in spite of the fact that we live in beautiful, sunny California, why the weather was impacting cargo here on the West Coast. Last time we checked the weather report, it was 70 degrees and sunny out there in Southern California. Dave, you're crazy. Well, it is a transportation network. And the weather that we've been experiencing in Chicago and in New York, railroads are holding trains in Southern California, and that is causing a disruption in the entire supply chain. Boxes that would have loaded out on the ship, or on the train, and the chassis back to the terminal to continue to work, weren't moving. So it caused a temporary chassis shortage. The chassis are still all there. They have not been taken out of service. They're just out of sequence. They're just out of cycle. And it takes time for that to work back in. The same type of impact I'm drawing a parallel to is what's taking place in the terminals as these ships get larger. So as these ships have gotten larger, and an economy that is not growing at that same speed, you then come to a point is, how are we filling these mega ships? And it was brought up in the previous panel through the Panama Canal. You know, we don't see this huge growth in terms of volume going through the Panama Canal, and quite frankly, we saw negative growth last year. But if you really look at it, it's because when carriers look back at their financials over the last 3 years, the area that we were losing the most money was on the East Coast, all-water services through the Panama Canal. And that was because slot cost inefficiency. We are limited, all of us. There's no competitive advantage to any of us. Panamax is it. About 4,500 TEU size ship maximum that you can get through the Panama Canal today. And you need at least 8 of them to run a fixed-day weekly service from Asia to the U.S. East Coast. It was very, very costly, and we were losing money. So last year, we started the emergence of East Coast all-water via the Suez Canal. And we were able to use much larger ships at a much improved slot cost economy of scale. The area that doesn't serve is North Asia because of the transit time difference. But what's happening with this is, as these ships have gotten larger, carriers have realized, I've just added 20% capacity, but I can't fill it in a market that's only growing 3 to 4% per year. So what do? The emergence of these mega alliances. To me, this is the most significant impact that our industry will have this year. Everybody's talking about the P3 with Maersk, MSC, and CMA. We're talking about the G6 alliance, which Hyundai is a part of. We're talking about expansion with the CKYH and perhaps Evergreen being added. These mega alliances, how do you take a ship that's much larger and fill it, well, you divide it up by a larger number of carriers on that same ship, and you start displacing some of the smaller ships. We've seen unprecedented levels of scrapping of the small to medium-sized ships over the last 3 years. So those smaller ships are going by the wayside, and we're seeing much larger ships here emerging. So emerging trends in 2014, mega ships have caused the need for mega alliances. And this represents a huge opportunity for California for 3 points. One, we've got natural deep sea ports, so we are big ship ready already today in LA, Long Beach, and in Oakland. Geographic proximity to Asia, and in spite of the fact that we're seeing a lot of growth outside of China, China is still that manufacturing engine. And if we think about it, LA Long Beach today handles over 40% of the nation's total import volumes as a single gateway. But what we've got to think about is volumes are not growing double digit like they were back in the mid-2000s. And now California is playing defense. We've got to hold on to the volumes that are transiting through California ports today. And how do we do that? First and foremost, I think we've fallen into this we've become lax. We've taken our ports for granted. We think that no other ports can replace California ports. And to one extent, I agree. We're not talking about doom and gloom where California ports would be replaced. But if we're only looking at 3 to 4% growth, and Canada takes a couple percent, and Seattle, Tacoma takes a couple percent, and East Coast All Water takes a couple percent, we're now looking at flat at most, maybe negative growth. So nobody's going to come in and completely replace this, but it's certainly we're going to find a lot of bites taken out of little bits and pieces that when you collectively add them up represents a significant amount of cargo potentially lost. Cargo has, I heard John McLaurin speaking a couple of weeks ago, and cargo has no loyalty in gateways, and that's absolutely the case. It finds the path of least resistance. These retailers are looking for velocity, they're looking for reliability, and they're looking to make sure that their supply chains continue to run uninterrupted. And if they have to shift it to a different gateway, they'll do it in a New York minute. So there is no real a loyalty factor that factors in there. And to do that, we've got to be cost competitive in these ports. We've got to have high productivity in these ports. And we've got to have competitive regulatory policy. I think all of us want to make sure California has green ports, clean air, but we've also got to make sure that we don't jump so far out ahead of the rest of the national transportation policy and other ports that we're competing against that we actually discourage cargo from coming into California because of greater regulatory impacts. We have world-class infrastructure, road, rail, and warehousing, and that's critical. And really, the cargo that we've got to really watch is the discretionary cargo. And discretionary cargo is cargo that's not destined for California, but it's destined to some inland point where California is just the discharge port. It's moving to Chicago, to Dallas, to Houston, to the East Coast. That's the cargo that could be routed through another gateway. And that's the cargo that is the most at risk. And for LA Long Beach, that's about 50% of the total volume. 50% of the cargo that comes in on the ships today stays in the greater LA Long Beach area, with the other 50% is truly discretionary cargo moving to some inland destination. And that's half of the business that we could start to see being filtered and channeled through other alternative gateways. This is a particular sensitive year for West Coast ports. The ILWU contract expires on June 30th. That was a 6-year contract. Negotiations have not formally begun yet, but we expect them to start sometime in the May time period. There are some hot buttons that are certainly, with any labor contract negotiation, that are going to be discussed. I can tell you that the fact that the ILA contract, which covers the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports, was last year, that this is fresh on the mind of every major retailer in the country. My phone has been ringing off the hook asking for suggestions and recommendations on contingency plans and routings because they're very concerned about a disruption. And it is something that every retailer has got some kind of a contingency plan that they're putting together. There's limitations as to how much you can actually reroute. It's a little easier, actually, from an Asia trade perspective to find alternatives to your East Coast than it is to your West Coast. But we are definitely seeing, I think Canada is going to certainly be a beneficiary this year of cargo that's destined into Chicago and into all the way into Memphis. I think the Port of Houston is going to also be a beneficiary this year of cargo that's destined into the Port of Houston and even points up as far north into Dallas. The East Coast, I think, will see an extension of the reverse IPI lines beyond about the 200 miles from the port range. But getting all the way back to the West Coast still remains the big challenge here. Port and terminal reshuffling. When we talk about all these mega alliances happening, now you've got a number of different carriers on the same ship. Many of us here on the West Coast own and operate our own terminals. Obviously, if you own and operate a terminal and you've made that kind of a capital investment, you want your ships calling at those terminals. So it's the reason why the West Coast alliances kind of lagged behind some of where the East Coast expansion took place, where there are more third-party neutral terminals up and down the East Coast. We are definitely going to see some shuffling that takes place with terminals, and that is just a necessary evil to help facilitate the smooth movement of goods. And it's going to be a challenge not just for the port infrastructure, but the inland as well. We talked about two major East Coast railroads and two major West Coast railroads. The sooner we could have a transcontinental railroad, the better off we'll be, because at this point, we're dumping all of this cargo into a port that they have to then take 50% of that cargo and to put on a train, but part of that goes on the BNSF network, part of that goes on the UP network, and then, oh wait, this carrier uses CSX as an eastern railroad, so the BNSF network now has to be split out to say, oh, to steel wheel interchange this, we've got to build two trains, one that goes to CSX at the connecting point, the other that goes to Norfolk Southern at the connecting point. It adds a lot of extra planning and coordination in making sure the supply chain network maintains its continuity. Carriers have been focused more and more on port-to-port business. Carriers have been subsidizing the inland moves for years. And as fuel prices have gone up, the inland prices have not gone up in line with those. So carriers looking at their profit and loss on a lane-by-lane origin-destination segment have seen there's more money to be made on just the basic port-to-port business, and they've been pricing themselves to a point where there's kind of a tipping point on the scale, which I think Fran will talk a little bit about, where we're starting to now see more and more retailers seeing a cost-benefit analysis of bringing in cargo that might be destined to Chicago through LA Long Beach, and instead of moving it intact in an ocean-going container all the way through, doing a West Coast transload into a 53-foot trailer, and that, I'm teeing it up for Fran over there. And then last, East Coast all-water growth via the Suez. That's really what we're to watch. Competition is healthy. I think you're going to see the Suez Canal is going to help when the Panama Canal expansion finally is completed. I think the Panama Canal Authority is going to have to look very seriously at the business they thought they may have had in their pocket that has now shifted via the Suez Canal, and it makes sense for points from Hong Kong, Yantian, south and west. Anything above that is still a choke point today in the supply chain because it really has to go through the Panama Canal, as you're talking about North China and Korea and Japan. But we are certainly going to see this emerge, and I think we're also going to find the railroads as they begin to see how cargo shifts. There will be larger ships. I think we will see when the Panama Canal opens, 8,000 TEU ships already looking for a home to be deployed, put in there, and they will be full, not because one carrier fills them, but because 3, 4, 5, or 6 carriers are now participating on those same ships. And there'll be fewer 4,500 TEU ships going through there, which, if you look at the Panama Canal today, is already constrained not by the number of ships and the scheduled appointments going through. And I think the Panama Canal Authority would appreciate fewer container ships going through so that they can take advantage of bulk ships and tankers that could now transit the canal that in the past were unable to do. So to wrap it up, our industry is facing some very rough seas at this time. And it has been years and years of losses. In the last 3 years, our industry has lost in excess of 15 billion US dollars. It is not a sustainable model. These mega alliances, in my opinion, are a call to action to try to right the ship, and it's a survival play. We are not looking to take advantage of passing discounts on to beneficial cargo owners by reducing these slot costs. We're hoping that by reducing these slot costs, maintaining rates where they've been, that'll be enough to take us from the red to the black. And if these mega alliances aren't able to do that, where there still is selection, where you still do have 3 carriers in the P3 or 6 carriers in the G6 alliance to choose from, if this is not able to right that ship and allow carriers to move back to the level of profitability, we're moving a lot of cargo for practice, not profit, then I think what we will find is that there will be more consolidation in the industry, and there will be fewer selections in the future. So I urge everyone to embrace these mega alliances, support these mega alliances. There's challenges in the network to support them. However, it's really a survival play for the industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. That was excellent, and you actually served as a good segue into both of our panelists, but let's do one panelist at a time. We want to hit the trucking sector first. And Dave, what you were saying about the alliances, 5 or 6 carriers coming in with containers on one ship. Just think if you were a trucker and you called at a terminal where one of the G6 carriers calls, and you had a chassis that was owned by one of the carriers, but a container by another carrier, and you could drop a container off at one terminal, but they're not going to take the chassis because that's not their chassis, so you've got to take that to another terminal, but who's going to pay for that? And then with the gate congestion, this is not a good time to be a harbor trucker. But if anybody can handle it, and anybody's tough enough to do it, it's Vic LaRosa. Okay. Vic's spent 30 years in the transportation industry, so, I mean, look at, he's still happy. So, this is one tough cookie. So Vic is president and co-founder of Total Transportation Systems, Inc., TTSI. And Vic, take it away.
Thanks, Bill. I'm really not that tough. Anyway, I think that these are really exciting times, and I kind of have to continue on David's theme about emissions. The game changer for the trucking industry was the Clean Truck Program. And there is no turning back. Although the ports and the cities and the Air Resources Board did, so to speak, grease the skids and provided some incentive money to get the industry moving to the cleaner trucks. The industry came out of pocket about $1 billion to replace those trucks. And we did it in a very, very short period of time. And I think that the industry should be very proud of itself, and I think a lot of the constituents in California are very proud of what the industry has done. But as I said, there's no turning back. We have to move on now to keep advancing the gains that we've made in air quality. TTSI is a company that is very environmentally oriented. We are a harbor drayman, and we also do a lot of regional trucking as well. We see the need for these cleaner trucks, and we also are experimenting with straight battery electric Class 8 trucks and Class 8 hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. We've got one of each in the fleet, and we're getting ready to take delivery on another 8 of the electric trucks and hopefully 4 of the hydrogen fuel cell trucks. And we're doing this because we believe that, that zero emissions can be obtained. However, none of this is going to be possible if we don't tackle the number one issue that we're facing in the ports. And we have an opportunity here in California to lead the world, because, did the lady from Canada leave? If anybody's tried to pull containers out of the Vancouver port, it's not the easiest thing in the world. If you've tried to pull containers out of the Northern California ports, it's very, very difficult. If you try to pull containers out of the East Coast ports, it's a nightmare. So it's, you know, there's a lot of room for opportunity and for improving the efficiency. I'm not talking about productivity, I'm talking about efficiency. And there's a tremendous distinction between the two. Because of the cost of these vehicles, we have to look at the duty cycle of the vehicle. If we make these vehicles more efficient in the amount of containers that they pick up on a shift or per hour, the more money will be generated to the truck or to the trucking company. We will also have the benefit of reducing the amount of trucks that will be required. And regardless of what the mode of trucking is, whether it's diesel or natural gas or zero emissions, less trucks is better all the way around for the environment because there's less vehicles on the freeways. So there are many benefits to improving the efficiency. So what the Harbor Trucking Association in Southern California has done is that they've pulled together what we call a truck mobility study. We've got about 1,600 trucks currently in the system that are all GPSed. We've had the study and the method of collecting this information reviewed by a third party, and we've put certain parameters in there where we've eliminated any container that took over 5 hours in the coming out of the gates. We've thrown that out of the study, and we've anything under 15 minutes we've thrown out of the study. And believe it or not, actually a couple of terminals actually got hurt by that because there are some very efficient operators. The study has been launched, and it is on the Harbor Truckers website, and it's available through subscription. But we're more than happy to share it with anybody that really wants to look at it. So this is the results of the study. Now, the most significant part of this study is really the column all the way to the far right. We don't want to get into a situation where we're pointing fingers at marine terminal operators or steamship lines or whatever. The issues that you've heard today are a result of the changes that our industry are going through. And we are kind of the last, piece in the puzzle, because it all gets dumped on the truck when it goes to the gate to pick up that container. We understand what the situations are. We understand, what the big ships are doing. We understand the overloads on the marine terminals. But here is an opportunity to now really take some of the money that we are talking about, infrastructure dollars. Some of the money, there's a lot of waste in this system. There's a tremendous amount of waste in waiting time, in increased inventory carrying costs by BCOs. So there's a lot of money in the system to look at this program and come up with more efficient ways to disperse this traffic through the terminals. When you see that 22% of the cargo is taking longer than 2 hours, remember that because of the conditions of the shift at a terminal, there is really only about 6 hours of available time for a truck to get in and out of that terminal because of breaks, lunches, and other conditions that happen. So in 6 hours, on any given shift, we have to move a lot of cargo. And if you talk about increasing the number of containers that you're going to be putting in these marine terminal operators, the only answer is increased efficiency. You compound the problem now by 2 other things. The first thing is Pier Pass. At its inception, Pier Pass was a great idea, and it achieved what it was supposed to achieve. It changed behavior. However, we now have a much cleaner truck fleet to operate in Southern California area. So maybe it's time to look at Pier Pass and look at the cost associated with Pier Pass and figure out a new way to allocate those costs. The second thing that is heavily impacting this, outside of the volumes that have increased to the terminals, is the steamship lines transformation out of the chassis business. We don't care who, the trucking industry doesn't care who owns the chassis. What we want is just a very efficient way of handling those chassis. When the equipment providers came in, the DCLIs, the Flexis, the Tracks, they were traditionally in the wholesale environment. They now have moved into the retail environment. The only issue is that they were not ready for handling those retail transactions. A lot of this burden fell on the backs of the trucking industry. Again, unintentionally, you increase costs, because when the trucking industry now has to administer chassis, they have to charge the BCOs for that administration. There are better ways, and thanks to the ports of both Long Beach and LA, they pulled together a stakeholders committee that really has everyone sitting on, all the rails, the marine terminal operators, steamship lines, the truckers. Everyone is sitting on that stakeholders committee, and the stakeholders committee went out through the port initiative and hired a consultant to really kind of isolate all of the variables and kind of pull a package together to present to industry to say, hey, this might be a better way to do it. The ports are really doing their part in moving these initiatives forward and looking at these efficiencies issues and trying to figure out a better way to get it accomplished. That's what makes for very, very exciting times. These larger ships will be the answer to solving a lot of our issues, and there are issues too in terms of environment, in terms of cost reduction, in terms of having a very, very healthy trade environment. But we have to address the unforeseen circumstances that they create, and the efficiencies at the gates are probably the number one issue, especially from our perspective, because we will not be able to pay or transition to the new technologies, which are going to be more expensive than the current technologies, but the payback in health gains and the payback to the environment are worth doing. But we have to prepare ourselves now and figure out the systems that we want to put in place, and it's going to take some dollars, and the industry is not shy from contributing dollars to these projects to make a more efficient system. And I want to thank you for your time.
Thanks, Vic. Thanks. That was very good. Well, Vic may or may not be one tough cookie, but I can tell you for sure that Fran Inman is one tough lady. And the reason I know that is that, look at our houses, 1,800 or 2,000 square feet, and we have trouble managing that. Well, Fran manages 70 million square feet of commercial properties. She's Senior Vice President of Majestic Realty Company. She directs at Majestic government relations and community affairs activities, and Majestic is one of the largest privately held, family-owned real estate development companies, 70 million square feet of it. Fran?
Thanks. Thanks, Bill. And before I start, I want to give a shout out to Norman Fassler-Katz, too. I'm not sure where Norman, if he ducked out, but hats off to our good friend. I really, really remember the day that I showed up here and they all looked at me like I was from Mars because real estate developers didn't show up here. But I've been coming ever since and delighted to be here. So, Norm, we thank you for your contributions and look forward to many more, even though you're going to be wearing a maybe a little different hat. But we still have lots of work to do. So I think today, my main message is it's great that we moved over here because we needed more room from the original meetings, but those walls ought to be knocked down. And rather than preaching to the choir, which a lot of us are doing today. And I consider you all my folks. We all need to bring a friend next year, maybe somebody that we wouldn't think of as a traditional partner. Because as I like to say, every day is freight day. And if we all do a great job together, we're invisible. Life goes on. We all have everything on the shelves at Target the minute we want to go down there and get something. So I think it really, really is important, and we heard earlier, I think from Dan kind of chiding us to tell a better story. And I think we all have to put our heads together and really begin to communicate the story of how freight moves and how we are indeed a system of systems. Also, I'm going to follow Dave's lead. And Dave, thank you. You're a wonderful salesman for Majestic. We appreciate those transloading plugs. But I will tell you that while I wear multiple hats, my comments today are from my day job. As Mr. Roski likes to remind me, I do have a day job, and not those of my other positions. So these are from the Majestic story here. And I think what also is important is that we're all wearing the same jerseys here. As we hear the struggle of putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, the supply chain logistics is really a team sport, and I don't want any of us to forget that, because we're all going to rise or fall flat together, I think. So it is important. So Majestic, a little bit about our story, and sorry, those dark words. We had a debate at the office whether the white would show better or the black, but so anyway, here we are. Founded in 1948 by Ed Roski Sr., really just a commercial brokerage house at that point. It was really in the 60s when our current chairman, Ed Roski, pushed us to the next level, and we really truly became a fixed asset-based company. So as Bill mentioned, today we own 70 million square feet. We're headquartered in California. This is home. But we have offices in Las Vegas, Denver, Dallas, Atlanta, and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So of that portfolio, 40 million square feet in California. The next largest is Georgia. And I think if you look at, we've been in Georgia probably for about 20 years now. And I would say one of the major reasons that we're there is tied to the efforts of the Port of Savannah. And we talked a little bit about that earlier. So there's big logistics hub for us there. Nevada, interestingly enough, is third on the list, but that's really a different market. And we went to Nevada in the late 80s, thinking that it was a natural migration from our tenants in California, and it turned out we were wrong. So we built a casino instead, and that's been a fun journey. Many of you know my story as being the casino maven at one point in my career. But that market for us, really our growth, and this number is really just an industrial number. It does not include our casino holdings. But is really driven by the tourism and convention market, so that remains the main driver for us. And interestingly enough, most of that growth has occurred through participatory ground lease, and that's where we really saw an opportunity when the BLM transferred huge portions of land to Clark County under the sphere of influence of McCarran Airport. And so we, even though most of the cargo that lands in our warehouses is not air cargo, there's always this synergy that occurs. And so we figured out that we were indeed good neighbors. So we actually partnered with Clark County and have built something north of about 4.5 million square feet under a participatory ground lease deal. We're actually doing that in the state of California on some prison land in Southern California right now. We're in the development process. So once again, we found that that model works for us. So of all of our holdings, 95% is warehouse industrial distribution. So we really began our journey probably more than a decade ago when we'd hear from our tenants that they really couldn't make their turns to the port. So what's happening today, and this is where I'm going to have to go a little bit of discussion with some of the earlier panelists here today. If you look at our holdings in California, this is really the story of where our current development is, and it's not in California, guys. So as Wayne Gretzky likes to say, you've got to skate where the puck's going. Well, guys, I can tell you that we have 1.2 million under construction in Texas, 1.5 million under construction in Georgia, 1.2 million in Pennsylvania, and 500,000 square feet in Colorado. So we picked out the big ones. So there may be some smaller ones under construction in California right now. So interesting conversation with Bill a little earlier, talking about the Jones-Lang-LaSalle report and the tremendous growth in the Inland Empire. So we really tried to dig into that a little bit. And I think the answer is, while it is a very robust market, for our model being privately held, it's a different game than most of our competitors, which are real estate investment trusts. So our model is really to build and hold. So we're long-term asset base. When we go in, we know we're going to be there a really long time. And so that's kind of what we do. So to give you a little summary, we picked out some of the major tenants. This one's a little easier to read. And as Dick Steinke said, if you've been to one port, you've seen one port. I would argue that if you look at our list of our major tenants, if I talk to one chief logistics officer on Tuesday, I've talked to one chief logistics officer on Tuesday. So that's been kind of something that we've all had to learn, because my guys will go out, and we have significant holdings with Williams-Sonoma, and they'll come back and swear to me on this is how it works. And then another colleague will come along, and they happen to be working with Walmart, Target, you name it. It's all different, and it's all constantly changing. So on our journey of really understanding the supply chain, I think that's one lesson, loud and clear. It's a dynamic market, and we have to be a value proposition. So other key growth factors for us have been the 3PL market. And while we've heard earlier about some of the dynamics with the mega ships, I would argue that with e-commerce and the multi-channel distribution that's occurring at lightning speed, we haven't seen anything yet in terms of the rapid fire changes that are coming. Another distinction I think that's important is really look at the average length of leases. We're seeing on average in this sector, and I'm talking about really the distribution warehousing sector here, we kind of use 300,000 square feet as a bottom threshold. Our sweet spot is really 750,000 million square feet, because if we're going to build a building, it's just easier for us to build the really big ones. But what we've had with this huge growth with the 3PL market, we think one of the competitive advantages we have is within our portfolio. We're privately held. You know, we all report to Ed Roski. So if you need a little flex space, we can sit down and talk to it. And we literally have tenants that, because of the personalization, the mass personalization that's going on with the fulfillment centers, we've got this relationships that says, okay, I need another bay for 6 months. Can you work with me here? So that happens on a regular basis. So that's kind of the perspective. When we look at, as I mentioned earlier, we have a build and hold mentality, which I think is a little different, or I know it's different. But we are continuous students of our supply chain partners. So that's why we spend so much time listening to our rail partners, to our trucking partners. The beneficial cargo owners clearly are at the center of all of this. And then, you know, one big question mark that we're watching is what's going to be the impact of these mega alliances? How can we, add value? How can we have the positive impact? We expect cargo surges to continue. I think it stands to reason if we are going to really take advantage of our natural deep water ports and have these cleaner ships coming in, we're going to have some big clusters of cargo that need to work their way through the system. So I think, once again, the timing of some of these contracts, we heard earlier about our terminal operators that have a 25-year plus lease agreement. Now all of a sudden they're participating in an alliance. I've heard stories of, our one cargo, Maersk cargo is actually going to, land at another terminal, and that's just going to be how we're going to figure out how to have better utilization. So I think that, it's important for all of us to figure out how we can smooth out the supply chain. We'll all be better off, but it's dynamic times. So I talked a little bit about we haven't seen anything yet, and I truly believe that. Many of you know I work a gazillion hours, and I tell you that my shopping's online, so free delivery, free shipping, what the heck, send it to my door. If it doesn't work, we send it back with free returns. So what does that do in terms of the transportation planning? So I don't know if you've all seen the report on e-commerce by Jones Lang LaSalle, but I think it's a great summary, and I would encourage all of you, when I do put on my transportation commissioner hat or GLUE council member at SCAG, I'm always chiding our planners, many of whom have graduated from school long enough ago that we didn't even know what e-commerce was. And I think it really, really is important as we try to move through SB 375 and build sustainable communities that we're integrated into those solutions, because we will not have sustainable communities unless we find a way to successfully get our goods to the people and the businesses. So great summary here talking about how we have evolved, and today, basically we're looking at e-commerce, e-fulfillment centers. Game changer is probably, Amazon Prime, which is one of the great customer loyalty programs ever, and certainly a game changer for U.S. Postal Service in terms of keeping them alive, I believe. And then pushing, we see this Sunday deliveries, what's happening. We've heard how the SKUs have gone up exponentially. In the retail sector has changed forever. Our bricks and mortar stores are really adjusting to the new landscape. And, mobile shopping. I was on the Talking Freight webinar, which hopefully all of you will watch if you missed it this morning, talking about the impact of freight in our urban regions and with the mega regions. And there was a great visual, and they called it the Blackberry Prayer. And it was all these young folks standing with their mobile device, either talking to each other or doing some shopping or something. But anyway, I think just the whole multi-channel distribution is a game changer for all of us. I think, if you look at the e-commerce, we're told that anywhere between 5 to 15% of the sales this last season occurred through the online shopping. So I think, as we see that ramp up, we're going to be seeing tremendous impacts in terms of, our mega e-fulfillment centers, which on average have 2 to 3 times the employees of the traditional, just because we all want our customization of our order. If we ordered our special Nike tennis shoe with just the right laces and colors. Also the parcel hubs, the e-fulfillment centers, and then also the return centers. Folks like me that say, okay, that's fine, didn't work, send it back. So I think the early adoption is at all different levels. You saw Walmart kind of, major retailer, a little slow out of the gate and just really catching up, I think, with their online. But we've got regulatory issues, whether or not they support online purchasing. Also, we've got security. We've all lived through the Neiman Marcus and Target credit card incidents. So I think those discussions will work their way through and we'll figure that out. But anyway, whoops, I went too far. We heard earlier about regulatory impacts, and I think we have to be very, very cautious. Currently, for our sector, at the Energy Commission, we've just begun the implementation of AB 1103, which is the benchmarking for all commercial properties. We've yet to implement the AB 758, which is the Skinner bill, which requires the retrofit of all existing commercial facilities. So we need to work through that and do it right. Clearly, we're all heavily engaged in the AB 32 and the SB 375, and our Air Resources Board is coming up with their sustainable freight strategy. On our local level in Southern California, it's our local air district, and a number of us have been working with them on, what should an indirect source rule look like if we need one, and also the port backstop rule. Many of us have a lot of sweat equity in the Clean Air Action Plan down at our ports now, so we're very proud of the changes that we've made and the improvements. So we're going to be actively engaged there. And then on the national level, I have the pleasure of serving on the National Freight Advisory Committee. We heard this morning about the Canadian model, and I can tell you that most of us are green with envy in terms of the fact that they started working on that in 2006, finished it, I believe, the initial phases in 2008, and are already talking about their success. So hopefully, we were encouraged by MAP 21 to have a freight title. I think that's the good news, but we still have an awful lot of work left to do, and clearly the funding issue, at some point, somebody's going to have to get a big round table out, and everybody's going to have to sit down and roll up their sleeves. The Highway Trust Fund is not going to be able to carry us forward, and we have a push for alternative fuel and our improved efficiencies. So not only have we not indexed the Highway Trust Fund, but we also have fuel sources that we don't have a mechanism to contribute to the infrastructure. So I'm hoping we can have some good debates. I don't have a preconceived notion of what the answer would be, but I think it's imperative for all of us to have those discussions, and I'll call out Dan and the work the Tioga Group on, is it TRB 15? What's the number of that report? That talks about freight funding and 29? Okay. But great debate, and we need to have more debates along those. I think the conclusion of that was that there's no silver bullet, so we better all get together and figure out what the options might be. And I say that in the plural. Also, the California Freight Advisory, and I'm thrilled to have my partners here from California with Ben and Bruce taking copious notes, and Carrie today. I've been accused of being the head cheerleader on the Commission for the Supply Chain, and I proudly wear that jersey because I think it is so very important for our state. So I asked the question of our Canadian panelists this morning about how to engage the private sector. And I think if I had one wish, I would really figure out how we could more effectively engage those folks, like my fellow colleagues on the panel today, who are in the trenches every day, because I think they have the best perspective on what's happening and therefore have some really good suggestions for us on how we can improve. So also, we're anxiously working toward creating our California State Freight Plan. And I think the really great news with that is we recognize going in that it will never be finished, that we will be continuously updating it on a regular basis, and that's as it should be, because if nothing else, what I want to leave you with was the fact that this is a very dynamic world and a very exciting sector that we're in, and we're in the midst of a whole bunch of change. So thank you.
Thanks, Fran, and you saved the best for last with the California Freight Plan. So, we'll get together, get it done, and have one voice when we go to the federal government and MAP 21. So I know, David, we're running late. Should we take a couple of questions? Okay, let's do it.
This question's for David. Good presentation. I'm curious, with the new ship builds, there's been a lot of talk about, on the water side, alternative fuel, LNG. For HMM, what's on the books for you guys in terms of LNG?
It's a great question, and it's certainly an emerging model. Right now, where it's gaining the most traction is really with the domestic Jones Act carriers that tend to operate more within the confines on a regulated basis within the emissions control area in that 200-mile range. So you're finding a lot of the carriers like HMM and others that really are in and out, that are more on the deep sea, longer haul trades, are not yet investing in that technology. It's really, I think the early adopters are going to be your Totes and your Horizons and those carriers that are involved in the Jones Act trades, where that's kind of the area, the playground that they play in. They operate in a very dense form within the ECA.
Quick question: how is we're talking about the driving regulation for truck drivers that will take effect in July 1st, 2014? How this will affect the intermodal industry?
You're talking about hours of service? It's significantly affecting the industry. There's creating driver shortages. It's a regulation that we think needs to be looked at, because we call it a daily driver rule. We're trying to get a daily driver rule in place, and that basically says if you start and stop at the same place every night, you should be under a different requirement, because it's not as strenuous as driving long haul. So the industry, the California Trucking Association, the American Trucking Association are very active with the federal government in trying to get a differentiation on the hour of service rules. The gains that are being made by really restricting these hours, the story's still out on that. The studies still have not come back to see if there's a significant amount of data that is changing the results of these lower hours of regulation. But it is going to affect the price of freight. Price of freight will go up if the driver shortage continues.
This question's for David. You mentioned in your presentation that currently the large ships, the 18,000 TEU ships, are largely visiting the East Coast through the Suez Canal. One of the things we hear about for the West Coast and be more robust for deep water ports is that even with the expansion of the Panama Canal, the largest ships are not going to go through it. But it sounds like, at least present day and the foreseeable future, the ships that are calling on the West Coast can fit through the canal. Is that the case, and do you see that changing, in the near future?
Actually, let me make a correction to that. The 18,000 ships that I mentioned, the 18,000 TEU ships, they're not calling the U.S. East Coast. They're calling Asia to Europe through the Suez Canal. So that's where those ships are applying today, and it's the longest deep sea trade route in the world, so there's a great economy that's there. The ships that they displaced are ships of 8 to 10 to 12,000 TEUs, and because those ships could not fit through the Panama Canal in its current configuration, carriers had made a decision to start moving those into the U.S. East Coast all-water trades via the Suez. I think once Panama Canal expansion is complete, you will see that absolutely follow suit through the Panama Canal of ships of similar size that are all displaced out of the Asia to Europe theater that will be looking for room, and with improved economies of scale. And where I think you'll see most of that concentrated is on vessels that are originating in North Asia, Korea, Japan, and North China, Shanghai, Ningbo, Dalian, where Suez is not a viable option because it's too long a distance.
Thank you.
Okay,
We got one more? Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be quick. Fran, this is a question for you in regards to the e-commerce. And you said we're going to see a lot of change coming up, and it sounded like you're talking about our local land use needs to get ready to accommodate the home delivery, that we're not ready to do that. Could you speak a little bit more about what warning you were giving us on that?
Well, I think it's just a huge change in terms of, all of us want immediate gratification. And so there's, we've looked at same-day delivery and, same hour delivery is even possible. I think one of the things I worry about in terms of the way we bundle our pricing, and I'll use myself as an example. We live in as rural as you can get and live in Orange County, but little narrow, winding, unincorporated Orange County. And so we have a very narrow, winding roads. We actually have a gate at the bottom of our little street. I'm not sure why it's there, but we have a gate. And then our house was built upside down for view purposes, so you have to climb the stairs to get the front door. So what was really telling to me was my husband and I were on a little vacation, and we came home, and it seems I'd done some ordering, so we opened the front door to about 20 packages sitting at the front door. And usually they kind of dribbled in, so I'd open the door and throw them in the closet and then open them later. But anyway, so I'm thinking about all the inefficiencies that are built into that for the poor UPS driver. The little narrow roads that weren't really built for those trucks. And also all of those trips, because I get free returns, and so I don't have time to shop, so send it to my door. And I don't, putting myself down, but I'm not alone here, guys. And so, my bright idea, and I went to my friends at Chevron and tried to pitch this to Chevron, and they already have a partnership with Vaughn's, and I said, I need this delivery zone. And Amazon has attempted that to a little bit. But it needs to fit into how we all live our lives anyway. And we're empty nesters, so you really can deliver mine to the supermarket, because my days of going to the market on a regular basis are gone when the last teenager went off to college. But occasionally I have to show up at the gas station. So my delivery zone could be there. It's down near the freeway, and, that would work. My daughter-in-law, who's a Starbucks patron, I thought she could have hers at Starbucks because she's running through their drive-through line on a regular basis. But I'm hoping that we really have some creative thinking that goes into that. And then on the land use, I think, it's kind of sacred ground. Our local officials like to have land use authority. And I can't imagine what kind of a battle it would be if we tried to say, okay, we're going to take that away, and we've got a better idea for you. So we need to be respectful. But if we look at SB 375 with the CEQA exemption for housing and the focus on transit-related development, there was nothing in there for distribution. Our blueprint compass planning doesn't have any allowance for recognizing the fact that at some point we do need to get the goods to the folks. And we talked earlier about watching pennies all through the supply chain. Well, we're in that supply chain, and we fight over a half-cent rent often, and we lose a deal over a half-cent rent. So we know ours is pretty formulaic in terms of what we can pay for land, because, basically our model is concrete tilt up, 32-foot clear, maybe a little higher, cross dock, so it's all in one door and out the other. But they're pretty basic building. But, as I said, our sweet spot's, 750,000. Well, you need good-sized piece of land to be able to do that. And we also know that for our partners to succeed, we need critical mass. So as much as Vic would love to run out to a Majestic warehouse, he really loves it more if there's a Prologis one and there's a Majestic one, and you can get the synergy that occurs when we're all succeeding together. So I think it is important for all of us to be at the table, to understand the various business models. And I'm pushing all of my planners and policymakers to really try to get a clear grasp of logistics economics, because at the end of the day, that's what all of our partners are doing constantly, is fine-tuning. So I think the more we can understand, we tease ourselves about having the ladies of logistics in our area, and it's a crazy little informal thing. But what we have done is we have found partners from all the various sectors, and we learn from each other. We don't all agree, but at least we have our local folks that we can say, hey, Vic, how's that really working? Help us understand what happens when you're trying to make it work and complete your turn, and you've got the pier pass fees that figure into that, or, we're totally have eyes wide open on what these alliances are going to do and what they're going to mean. So you can kind of see by where we're building our new big buildings that we're betting on some more of that discretionary cargo may indeed take a little bit of a walk.
Okay, with that, the only thing left before Dave comes back up is to thank our panel.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to also thank Bill again. And one of the things that you may not know, or may not know from some of the slides that we've had throughout the program here, is the Journal of Commerce has been a multi-year media partner for the symposium here. So we really appreciate that. Thank you. Well, let me just do a kind of a quick wrap up here. This day one has started out pretty busy for your symposium staff. We had a pre-symposium legislative briefing over in the Capitol. We had 4 regulatory agencies represented there with a packed room full of actually some elected officials as well as their staffs, and that was a great turnout. We followed that with some legislative visits, hitting three main points that several of the associations in California have come up with as their high priorities. And then the Port of San Francisco hosted a luncheon for port commissioners. So the port commissioners from 7 of the 11 deepwater public ports in California attended that and got to hear Kish Rajan, who's with the Governor's Office of Business Development, talk about what they're up to too. And then of course we've had a couple of great panels here in the afternoon and an excellent keynote speaker. So big day, but we're not done yet, right? We still have one more thing to do, and that's over in the Capitol at 5:30 we start. 6:30 we're going to be doing the awards over there. So I want to make sure that you're all over there. Before we break up today, though, I want to remind you a little bit about tomorrow. I've enjoyed being your MC today. But tomorrow, our other co-chair, Captain Bruce Clark, is going to be your MC tomorrow. 7:30, we're going to have the donuts and coffee here, and 8 a.m. sharp, we start right in on a pretty packed day. The last panel is a great panel. You check your schedules and everything. You're going to want to stay for it. So if you've got an early flight, try to get it bumped back, because it's going to be a really good one, and that starts late in the afternoon. So with that, thank you.